It's another beautiful Saturday on learning penetration testing with FIXITGEARWARE-SECURITY. And as you all know, this concept of training is to expose you to a myriad of vulnerabilities and how hackers in real life try to uncover these vulnerabilities that exist within a web application. Last month's episode, we introduced the concept of how a hacker or non-ethical hacker would try to bypass the web application of a bank, in this case, a financial industry, by testing for certain vulnerabilities in sensitive endpoints that have the possibilities to be compromised. And in that last month training, we started with a vulnerability known as SQL Authentication Bypass. In that training as well, we described and we talked about how this vulnerability can occur. Giving an illustration, the concept of SQL Authentication Bypass was explained to be a situation whereby a hacker would provide a common username which are owned by administrators such as admin, super admin, and so on. And if that username does exist, the hacker would comment out other aspect of the input field, which in this case has to deal with the password. So once this part of this input field, which is the password, is commented out, the attacker would replay its request to be able to get the unauthorized access to sensitive areas such as the admin dashboard or account information to be able to gain access to that username or credentials that was supplied by the attacker. Now, the flaw of this vulnerability, or should we say the weakness that makes this vulnerability to be delicate, is that the SQL parameters are not properly sanitized. So as long as the username that was provided has the authorization to access that specific location of the dashboard, the client side input field is trusted by the server side that is receiving this request. And of course, when the server receives this request, it does authorize this web application to redirect to the sensitive area, believing that the person that is accessing this web application is a trusted user. Now, on this week's episode, we want to teach you the concept of vulnerability chaining using the previous lab example, which we demonstrated in last month's episode on penetration testing with FIXITGEARWARE-SECURITY. So why are we demonstrating the concept of vulnerability chaining on this week's episode? It's very simple. If you ever go to bug bounty platforms such as Bugcrowd or HackerOne, or Yes We Hack or Integrity, you will notice that despite the scope, programs do define the acceptable vulnerabilities. Okay, and when we talk about acceptable vulnerabilities, it means that these vulnerabilities were properly defined to be critical or has impact when you find them. So if they do not have any impact on the web application which you're testing, then the program owners or the people who manage these bug bounty programs will not be able to treat that as a good finding or a finding that deserves a reward. Now, distilling down this explanation, you can notice that further descriptions are being found on the type of vulnerability that can be acceptable. Now, when we talk about the type of vulnerability that can be acceptable, give an example of what we're going to demonstrate this week. We are going to demonstrate the concept of cross-site scripting. And in that concept of demonstration, we are going to teach you how a cross-site scripting can be acceptable, in this case, the banking application we're hacking, and in other cases where this cross-site scripting vulnerability cannot be acceptable. Okay, so after this week's training, we hope that you will be able to get an insightful concept of how you should understand vulnerability chaining and how you can test for other vulnerabilities when you have gained an initial foothold on a web application. Before we get started, It's very important that you read the disclaimer of this concept of penetration testing that is being demonstrated by FIXITGEARWARE-SECURITY. You are strictly advised that whatever we're going to teach or show or demonstrate here today is strictly for educational purposes. Any misuse of this training or information here within, we are not to be held liable or accountable, and you are mandated to face the law if violated in any way or condition. It is also important that words like non-ethical penetration testers are used over non-ethical hackers to prevent the violation of Google and YouTube policies. Having said this, let's now move on to the point of contention for today and focus on the topic and subject of our demonstration today. So on this month's red teaming and penetration testing, we are going to explain the concept of vulnerability escalation and chaining after exploitation. In this case, in our previous training, we demonstrated the vulnerability SQL Authentication Bypass. The concept of today's training is going to focus on cross-site scripting, a post-exploitation concept we have demonstrated after we have compromised the web application using the vulnerability known as SQL Authentication Bypass. And as you all know, the link for this demonstration is going to be this link that is displayed on the slide, and be the subsequent link we're going to be using to demonstrate every other types of vulnerabilities that we can show on how you can exploit a web application belonging to the financial industry. On our prerequisite, or what we demand of you, is we demand that you have an updated Kali Linux box on a VirtualBox machine, or known as VM. You should have the Wiperizer plugin on the browser of your choice if you're using Chrome, Firefox, or any other browser of your choice. Still, we have not gone to a more advanced concept of demonstrating vulnerabilities, so we strictly advise you not to get the Bob Suite Pro, but stick to the Bob Suite Community Edition. And of course, the most important part of this training is that we advise you to pay full attention and close attention to whatever explanation we have to demonstrate during the course of this training. So with that being said, let's head on to our Kali Linux machine and of course demonstrate this vulnerability. So over here, we already launched our Kali Linux machine, and we also have our Bob Suite Community Edition for this project for this week already running. And usually we proxy our requests via the Chrome browser. The concept of proxying our request via the Chrome browser is because, in this case, the Chrome is quite light to be used and of course not consuming a lot of memory or resources on our VirtualBox machine. Okay, so if you do not have a computer that has enough RAM space, you should be able to use this efficiently without having a slowness in your VirtualBox machine. So back to the demonstration. In our previous training, we assessed the lab, okay, Arturo Mutual, a banking web application built by Oracle and acquired by HCL. And during the course of this training, we demonstrated how a hacker could bypass this login form using known credentials such as usernames belonging to super users such as admin, super admin, and so on. So how did we demonstrate this vulnerability on last month's episode? It's very simple. After launching the web application, we open our Bob Suite, we turn on our proxy to intercept our request, right? Then we came here, we entered the word admin or the username admin, and we just provided a random password 123456, and we click on login. Now, upon clicking on the login, we discovered that our Bob Suite was able to intercept the request. So we moved it down to the repeater, and of course we turned off the proxy. Okay, this is to enable us to replay our request via the repeater after doing a little bit of modification and seeing what the response will be like. Now, having done this, we came over to the request that we sent, and we saw something very interesting. First of all, we saw the session ID, which is the cookie, indicating that, okay, the cookie session of this attempt has been captured. And the other sensitive vital information we captured was the UID, which is a representation of the username, and of course the passw, which is a representation of the password. So during that process, we said, okay, we are very familiar with the concept of SQL injection, or should I say structured query language injection vulnerability. Then we came over to the UID. We decided to try something very interesting. So we said single quote, and we say or 1 equals to 1, and we comment it out, right? And we send the request. Okay, so you can see there's a mistake because we made a mistake here, right? So let's go back to drop this request. Let's go back to our proxy. We intercept it on again. We'll say admin, and we'll say password 1 2 3 4 5 6, and we'll say proxy, and we send to repeater, and we turn this off, and we go back here, say single quote. Oh, there's a problem. Okay, sorry about that. We're going to launch our Bob sheet again. So having launched our Bob sheet, we decided to do something very interesting. We open the browser. In this case, we are using Chrome, okay, because it's a lightweight browser for this. And we navigated to the website, okay. Now, when we go to the website, we want to, route this request to a proxy, in this case, our Bob sheet, to capture the request and see how we can manipulate this request to our own advantage to take over this web application. So to do that, we go back to our Bob sheet, we turn on the proxy, we came here, we supplied a credential known as admin, and we came here, we set the word password, okay, then we clicked on login. Now, having intercepted this, we sent the request to our repeater, and of course we turned off our proxy, okay. So the essence of turning off our proxy is to enable us to repeat this request without having an interception or a blockage to see the response, okay. Now, the next thing we did is that we tried to inspect the traffic that we captured with our Bob sheet proxy, and we discovered something very important. First of all, we discovered that the session cookie was captured, even though these credentials were not verified yet. Then the UID, which is the username we supplied belonging to the admin, was captured. And of course, the password which we supplied, known as passw, was also captured. Now, to be able to test if this is vulnerable to SQL injection, we did something very interesting. We came over to our UID. Okay, we taught the SQL query to believe that whatever we supply here is okay, right? Then we say or 1 equals to 1, right? And we say comment out everything else. Now, when we did this, we sent the request, and we discovered that our response did not only give us a page redirection or location, but it also gave us an encoded information, which is the Atoro account. Now, we went back here, we copied this location, bank main.jsp, right? And we discovered that when we loaded this extension, or the page that we were redirected to, we were able to log in to this account. Now, let's now describe what we are trying to demonstrate this week on vulnerability chaining. Now, if we log out, in this case, we sign off, and we run the code script on this, you can see we have a cross-site scripting vulnerability. But if we go back, you can see that we got this cross-site scripting on the front end, or should we say the web page of the online banking platform. Now, if you refer this to the concept of bug bounty, this is where bug bounty programs will define that if you find a cross-site scripting in a non-authenticated section of their website or their program, it's not going to be considered as a vulnerability, because in this case, this endpoint that the cross-site scripting exists or does exist does not have any impact. Like, no information can be stolen, no sensitive data can be exfiltrated, and no credentials can be lost, right? But if we go back to the sign-in page, which we have gained access to, which is this one. Okay, our session cookie already expired, so we can send this again. Okay, new session cookie has been generated. Now, if we go back to this, which we have logged in, right? And we can demonstrate that after taking over this account, we executed cross-site scripting, and we can, compromise this target, then this is a critical vulnerability. You can see we are not signed up, right? Now, how is this critical? A malicious hacker could intentionally craft JavaScript and host it on his own server, which is the malicious server. And of course, sending this link to a list of compromised emails, or let's say email accounts that has been bought on the dark web, send these malicious links to users that have accounts with this financial industry. So when these users click this link, depending on the concept of what this attacker has configured the JavaScript to execute, this can either steal the cookie session of this user or redirect them to a malicious page, which is in this case a phishing page that was created by this malicious hacker to harvest further credentials such as password, usernames, and of course probably tokens, or let's say security questions such as date of birth and other sensitive information that they can use to hack into this legitimate user's banking account and of course steal their money. Now, if you're able to log into a website or a financial industry account and demonstrate that you are able to execute XSS on the authenticated user's account, this is considered a critical vulnerability because in this case, it is considered a sensitive part of the website. Okay, so having said this, how can a hacker in real life demonstrate that they can now redirect this page to their own server? It is very simple. We can launch our command prompt here. Let's split this to the right. Okay, good. Now on our root server, on our root account or root directory, we can create a random file. Let's say it's called atoro.txt. Right? Sorry, made a mistake. No. So you say touch. Sometimes I do confuse Windows commands with Linux. So we say touch atoro.txt. Now we have created atoro.txt. We can verify this and say ls pipeline grep atoro.txt. Good. So our file exists, right? Sorry about the confusion with Windows command. Now the next thing we have to do is very simple. We come here, we say ifconfig to get our Kali Linux IP. So this demonstration is to tell you how a hacker can harvest this sensitive information to their server and of course steal the account or transfer money from the legitimate user's account to their own personal account. Now remember, we're not going to demonstrate a code in terms of JavaScript codes that exfiltrate cookies and credentials for some reasons, not to violate the YouTube algorithm and of course policies. But this demonstration is just to show you how a hacker can create a file that has a malicious code, and of course send this link to the user, and once the user clicks this, it executes the JavaScript on the client side, in this case the user's browser, and of course exfiltrate that data to the malicious hacker server. Now we have gotten our Kali Linux IP, right? So we know that our IP here stands like our server, right? So we can come over here, we can say HTTP, sorry about that, Python 3, okay, module, spin HTTP server, right? Is this server, right? Did I get it right? I think so. http.server, and of course we specify the port we want our HTTP server to run. In this case we say port 80, not 89. Now we are running the HTTP server on the root directory where our malicious file exists. In this hacker's concept, it's going to be the what's it called, the malicious file that has the JavaScript code. Okay, now what are we going to do if we want to now further exploit this vulnerability, like crafting? So we can go back, we can see that this vulnerability was detected on the search query, right? So all we need to do is that we come over here, we'll say script. This is just the concept of what the hacker would do, right? Now we can see new, we'll say image, we'll say dot source, to be, in this case we say HTTP, and our Kali Linux IP is what? 10.0.2.15, right? 10.0.2.15, right? Now we want to call the malicious file which has the JavaScript code. You can say atoro.txt. Now see what's going to happen when we run this. Now when we run this, we go to our Kali Linux. We're supposed to see the response here. Okay, so let's check if we spelled it very well. atoro.txt. Now, do you know the reason why the script did not execute? Because we did not close the tag. Okay, so we have to close it because it's a JavaScript, right? And let's run this again. Can close this and run this again. And we go back here, we go back to our Linux. So by right, we're supposed to receive a response. Let me see. Okay, so you can see we made a mistake, not set a source, right? Let's get back, right? So we hit again. Now let's check. You can see over here, when we executed that command, it communicated with our IP, which in this case is our Kali Linux IP, demonstrating the attacker server, and of course getting the script, in this case the atoro.txt. Now in real life, this is not going to be a .txt, it's going to be .jsp. And when the hacker does create this .jsp file, the hacker can give a command which is known as conditional statement. Okay, so the command can be something like this. It will tell this to search for this. Let me come here. Atoro. Where's this? So the command can be like this. It can say if the user, that's what the JavaScript will do, is on this page, okay, then it can be get cookie, execution. It can be retrieve whatever information. Of course, before the hacker would craft this JavaScript, they would have inspected the form elements to understand how the let's say, for example, this one, form elements, let's see, table, body, account details. So list account. So they would know the various ID, what it's all about. And of course, once they are able to detect this, they can now craft their malicious script to be able to extract whatever information that they want. It can be to extract the account details. In this case, it can be a corporate account, or it can be a check-ins account. It can be a savings account. That is one aspect of what the script might be. It can also be that if the user, okay, is not authenticated, it should redirect them to a phishing page. In this case, the phishing page can be something like this, requesting for not just username and password, but other sensitive information such as security questions, phone number, and so on. Now, if the victim is not smart enough, they can easily get compromised by providing this information, which this phishing page does request from them. And of course, that will lead to a massive account takeovers of all customers that belong to that bank or have business transactions in terms of account openings or account holdings with that financial industry. Now, we hope that after we have explained this concept, you have understood the concept of vulnerability chaining and how you can chain an initial vulnerability that you have found, of course, with additional vulnerability you understand. In this case, we're demonstrating with cross-site scripting to have more critical impact on the organization's infrastructure. Now, it's important for you to note that not all organizations will treat cross-site scripting as a critical vulnerability, especially if this vulnerability was found in a non-sensitive location. But in our case, we have been able to demonstrate that when we logged in, we tried to run the code of cross-site scripting payload on the search function, and we discovered that this was able to execute this code. So in our case, we did not run the code on the search function while the user has not been authenticated. Rather, we executed this code when the user has logged in, and of course, discovered that when we run this code on the back end, in this case, the user's dashboard, the cross-site scripting is still able to execute. So in this case, this is considered critical because we can now craft a payload that reads the user's browser or activities on this bank application. And if it does, discover that the part, or in this case, the dashboard, the user is authenticated, then whatever concept of our code or the comments which we have defined in our JavaScript code will now be able to execute on the victim's browser and of course extract whatever information that has been defined or as defined in that JavaScript payload that was appended to the malicious link sent to the user, or in this case, the victim of this bank application. So we hope that on this week's training, you've been able to understand vulnerability chaining and how you can be able to perform actions that could be more critical when you are testing a web application. Please ensure that you put this into practice, learn and understand how vulnerabilities discovery works. And after learning how vulnerability discovery works, try to understand the concept of endpoints, or should we say vulnerable endpoints, that you can test specific kinds of vulnerability. Okay, for example, the endpoint where you can test authentication bypass might not be the same endpoint where you can test cross-site scripting. Okay, so it's very important that you first of all understand these vulnerabilities. Then you move on to understand how or where can you test the vulnerabilities to discover if they exist or not. And after you've been able to understand this, you can now understand how you can chain this concept to get more impact or have more critical findings when testing a web application. Thank you for watching, and we hope to see you on next month's episode on penetration testing with FIXITGEARWARE-SECURITY, and bye for now.